there's a silent migration occurring that remains largely unnoticed. The most aware, conscious, and psychologically mature individuals are gradually stepping back from conventional society. Not with hostility, not with fanfare. They're simply fading away, moving off the grid, departing social platforms, walking away from professions, dissolving partnerships, selecting isolation over integration. Carl Jung foresaw this phenomenon. He termed it the essential retreat, occurring when an individual achieves such psychological awareness that engaging with collective unawareness becomes genuinely distressing. Not symbolically distressing, literally, bodily, mentally distressing. I'm going to explore why Jung considered this withdrawal not merely unavoidable for those experiencing awakening, but necessary. Why expanding consciousness makes ordinary society increasingly intolerable, and why this represents neither spiritual avoidance nor escapism, but rather the mind's protective response when immersed in widespread unawareness. If you've experienced the urge to retreat, to vanish, to abandon everything familiar, Jung would suggest you're not exhibiting antisocial tendencies. You're developing consciousness beyond what the collective structure can contain. Here's what Jung grasped that illuminates everything. Society operates through collective unawareness, shared illusions, mass projections, mutually agreed upon shadows. These aren't flaws in the framework. They constitute the framework itself, and it functions only when everyone participates unconsciously. The instant someone truly awakens, not merely intellectually, but psychologically, they become an anomaly in the system. They perceive the projections others inhabit. They identify the shadows everyone sidesteps. They comprehend the games playing out beneath awareness. And once this vision arrives, reversal becomes impossible. Jung lived this reality personally. As his awareness deepened, he found conventional social engagement increasingly unbearable. Not from arrogance, but from being awake in a space filled with sleepwalkers. Every exchange demanded he pretend blindness to what he witnessed, ignorance of what he understood, incomprehension of what truly transpired beneath surface interactions. This represents consciousness's burden. You become psychologically isolated, regardless of physical proximity. You're articulating a different dialect, perceiving alternative dimensions, functioning from separate realities. And the exertion necessary to span that divide, to perpetually translate between your awareness and collective unawareness, becomes draining. So the awakened begin vanishing. Not from societal hatred, but because remaining requires consciousness betrayal. Daily existence demands feigned sleep. Every encounter requires diminished illumination. Every connection requests you become less than you've evolved into. And ultimately, the psyche declares, enough. Retreat. Protect your awareness. Cease allowing collective unconsciousness to deplete what you've struggled to cultivate. Jung discovered that integrating your personal shadow makes the collective shadow unbearable to observe. You're witnessing an entire civilization projecting its darkness while refusing acknowledgement. After confronting your own capacity for malevolence, watching others project theirs onto scapegoats becomes agonizing. After integrating your own darkness, witnessing society's shadow projections, the opposing political faction is malevolent. That demographic is problematic. Those individuals represent what's wrong, feels like observing mass delusion, because that's precisely what occurs. Jung named this the burden of perception. The awakened individual recognizes that most societal conflicts merely represent shadow projections. Wars manifest as collective shadows colliding. Political rifts embody mass projections. Social media outrage represents collective shadow material seeking targets. Once this clarity arrives, participation becomes impossible. You cannot join the crowd when you perceive it's pursuing its own shadow. You cannot choose sides when you understand both sides project. You cannot participate in collective blame when you recognize it as collective unawareness. So, you withdraw, not from superiority, but from psychological requirement. One of Jung's students articulated it perfectly. I once held passionate political convictions. Then I integrated my shadow and recognized my convictions were merely projections. Now, observing political disputes, I witnessed two factions violently projecting their unconscious material at each other while naming it justice or truth. I cannot participate anymore. It would mean joining mass delusion. But here's what's actually occurring. The awakened aren't merely observing the collective shadow, they're sensing it. When you become conscious, you develop energetic sensitivity. Being surrounded by unconscious shadow projection feels like psychological assault. It's not judgment, it's authentic, energetic incompatibility. Jung noticed this in his own existence. Following his individuation, being in crowds became nearly intolerable, not from people dislike, but because he could sense the unconscious material circulating, the projections, suppressions, shadows, all generating a psychological tempest that only he seemed to perceive. This explains why awakened individuals abandon social media first. It's a perpetual shadow projection apparatus. Every scroll delivers an assault of unconscious material. Every comment section becomes a shadow sparring arena. For someone who's integrated their shadow, it resembles being forced to watch people strike themselves while blaming others for their wounds. Jung's second insight: once you've individuated toward your genuine self, persona, performance becomes impossible, yet society demands nothing except persona performance. Before awakening, you could execute social games unconsciously, smile when anticipated, articulate appropriate things, fulfill your role. But once you've contacted your authentic self, that deeper truth beyond all facades, returning to persona performance feels like psychological extinction. Every social context demands performance: the professional persona, the familial role, the social media identity, the acceptable perspectives, the appropriate emotions. For someone still identified with their persona, this feels ordinary. For someone who's discovered their self, it feels suffocating. Jung discovered this through personal experience. After his confrontation with the unconscious, he couldn't perform the conventional Swiss psychiatrist anymore. He couldn't pretend agreement with collective opinions he saw through. He couldn't sustain relationships requiring falseness. So, he retreated to Bollingen, his tower beside the lake, where he could exist authentically. This isn't antisocial, it's pro-authentic. The awakened individual isn't rejecting society from anger, but from incompatibility. They've become too genuine for environments requiring pretense, too authentic for spaces demanding performance, too integrated for containers accepting only fragments. One of Jung's patients, a successful executive who'd experienced individuation, described the impossibility. I attend board meetings where everyone performs their executive roles, articulating what executives should say, thinking what executives should think. I cannot do it anymore. It's like being asked to pretend I'm someone I've never been. My authentic self has no expression in that space. Only my persona did, and it's deceased. She didn't dramatically resign. She quietly disappeared, transitioning gradually over months, relocating to a small town where she could be real rather than successful. Not from failure, but from the success of self-discovery. This happens everywhere. The awakened are departing careers requiring persona performance, concluding relationships built on false selves, abandoning social circles, demanding masks. They're not failing at society, they're succeeding at authenticity. And that success makes societal participation impossible. Here's what Jung understood energetically. Maintaining consciousness in an unconscious environment demands tremendous psychological energy, and awakened people are recognizing it's unsustainable. Consider what the conscious person must do in ordinary society. Constantly filter unconscious projections. Maintain boundaries against energy depletion. translate between depth and surface, hold their frequency while surrounded by static, process not just their own material, but the unconscious material everyone else leaks. Jung called this psychological labor, the invisible work conscious people perform merely to exist in unconscious spaces. It's exhausting. Every interaction requires you to not react to projections, not absorb others' unconscious material, not get drawn into collective dramas, not match the unconscious frequency surrounding you, not betray your truth to maintain harmony. For unconscious people, this isn't work. They're flowing with the collective current. For conscious people, it's like swimming upstream in a tsunami of unawareness. Eventually, you must exit the water or drown. Jung noticed his most conscious patients would develop chronic fatigue, mysterious ailments, depression, not from personal pathology, but from exhaustion of maintaining consciousness in unconscious environments. The cure wasn't therapy. It was withdrawal from the environment straining them. One woman, a teacher who'd awakened through years of inner work, developed severe chronic fatigue. Medical examinations revealed nothing wrong. Through analysis with Jung, she realized she was expending massive energy maintaining her consciousness while surrounded by unconscious colleagues and students daily. She wasn't ill. She was energetically exhausted. When she left teaching and relocated to a cabin in nature, her energy returned within weeks. Not from rest, but from no longer having to sustain consciousness against the constant pressure of collective unconsciousness. This explains why awakened people disappear to nature, to solitude, to small conscious communities, not to escape responsibility, but to preserve the consciousness they've worked diligently to develop. They understand that consciousness is precious and finite, and expending it on unconscious interactions resembles pouring water into sand. Jung identified this withdrawal as archetypal, the hermit phase that every individuating person must enter. Not permanently, but necessarily. The psyche requires solitude to integrate what society would fragment. The hermit archetype isn't about misanthropy, it's about psychological necessity. When you're transforming fundamentally, you need space from influences that would pull you back to old patterns. You need silence to hear your inner voice. You need solitude to integrate without interference. Jung himself underwent profound hermit phases. His years at Bollingen weren't vacation. They were psychological necessity. He needed distance from collective consciousness to develop individual consciousness. He needed separation from others' projections to understand his own depths. This is what's happening to awakening people now. They're not disappearing because they're weak or antisocial. They're following an archetypal pattern that individuation requires. The hermit phase is when the shadow integrates without social pressure to suppress it. The self emerges without persona demands. Inner wisdom develops without outer noise. Psychological transformation completes without interruption. But here's what Jung emphasized. The hermit phase isn't escape, it's preparation. The awakened person withdraws not to abandon society, but to develop something society needs. They're gestating wisdom, integrating truth, becoming what Jung called deep-sea fish, beings who've adapted to depths others cannot reach. One of Jung's adolescents, a philosopher, disappeared from academic life for 3 years. Everyone assumed he'd experienced a breakdown. He'd experienced a breakthrough. In solitude, he integrated insights that would have been impossible while maintaining his academic persona. When he returned, he brought revolutionary ideas, but they could only emerge in withdrawal from the very system they would eventually transform. The hermit phase appears as disappearance, but it's actually deepening. The awakened person isn't fleeing. They're going deeper than society permits. They're doing work that can only be done in solitude, developing the consciousness that might eventually assist the collective, but only after it's fully formed. Jung's final insight offers hope. The disappeared don't remain gone forever, but when they return transformed. Not to participate in unconsciousness, but to offer consciousness to those ready to receive it. The awakened who disappear are following the hero's journey: withdrawal, transformation, return with gifts. But the return isn't to normal society. It's to the margins, the edges, the spaces where consciousness can exist without compromise. They become what Jung called border dwellers: present but not participating, available but not absorbed. They might return as artists creating from authentic depths, healers working with individuals ready to awaken, teachers sharing with small groups of seekers, writers offering maps for other disappearing souls, guides for those beginning their withdrawal. But they never return to the mainstream. They cannot. Once you've individuated, you cannot de-individuate. Once you become conscious, you cannot pretend unconsciousness. Once you've found yourself, you cannot live from persona. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly. His patients who fully individuated rarely returned to their previous lives. They created new ones, simpler, quieter, more authentic. They found ways to contribute without sacrificing consciousness. They learned to give without being consumed. One patient, a therapist who disappeared for 2 years, returned not to traditional practice, but to working with individuals going through spiritual emergency. She couldn't do general therapy anymore, only work with those experiencing what she'd experienced. Her practice was tiny, but profound. She was invisible to mainstream society, but a lifeline to those awakening. This is the model. Awakened people disappearing from mass society, but reappearing in conscious pockets, creating parallel structures, building alternatives, offering depth to those seeking it while remaining invisible to those who aren't. Jung believed this was evolution in action. Not everyone awakens simultaneously. The pioneers disappear first, create new spaces, then become beacons for the next wave. What appears as abandonment is actually architecture, building the structures that will support collective awakening when it's ready. Let me synthesize Jung's complete picture of why spiritually awake people are disappearing. They can no longer tolerate the collective shadow that unconscious society projects. Their authentic self cannot perform the persona that society demands. The energy required to maintain consciousness in unconscious spaces becomes unsustainable. They enter the necessary hermit phase that individuation requires. They eventually return, but only to conscious edges, not unconscious centers. This disappearance isn't failure, it's evolution. Not weakness, but wisdom. Not abandonment, but archetypal necessity. The awakened are following a pattern as ancient as consciousness itself: withdraw, transform, return transformed. Society experiences this as loss, abandonment, even betrayal. Where did all the conscious people go? Why are the wisest voices growing quieter? Why are the awakened abandoning the collective when it needs them most? But Jung would say they're not abandoning the collective. They're preparing something for it. In their withdrawal, they're developing what collective consciousness isn't ready for yet. In their disappearance, they're creating spaces for others to disappear to. In their silence, they're gestating words the collective cannot yet hear. If you're feeling the pull to disappear, Jung would want you to know this isn't spiritual bypassing or escapism. It's psychological necessity. Your consciousness has developed to a point where participating in collective unconsciousness is no longer possible without betraying yourself. The withdrawal you're feeling isn't antisocial, it's archetypal. You're not abandoning society. You're following the hermit's path that every individuating person must walk. You're not weak for being unable to tolerate unconsciousness. You're conscious. And consciousness requires different conditions than sleep. Let yourself disappear, not forever, but for now. Find your Bollingen, whether it's physical solitude or psychological distance. Stop expending your consciousness on unconscious interactions. Stop performing for audiences that cannot see you. Stop translating your depth into surface terms. Your disappearance isn't selfish, it's necessary. The collective needs people who fully individuated more than it needs people who partially participate. It needs depth more than surface, authenticity more than performance, consciousness more than conformity. And when you return, if you return, you'll return with gifts that could only be developed in disappearance. You'll offer what couldn't be offered while maintaining false belonging. You'll speak truths that couldn't be spoken while performing acceptance. The spiritually awake are disappearing because that's what awakening requires, not permanently, but necessarily. Not from hatred, but from love. Love of truth, consciousness, authenticity. Love that says, I must become whole, even if that means being alone. Jung would say, disappear consciously. Withdraw with purpose. Use your hermit phase for integration, not isolation. And remember, your disappearance is preparing something. You're not leaving the collective. You're pioneering where it will eventually need to go. If you're disappearing or feeling the pull to withdraw, subscribe to this channel where I explore Jung's insights for those walking the individuation path. Watch the video on your screen now about the hermit archetype and how to use withdrawal for transformation, not escape. Remember, your disappearance isn't abandonment, it's evolution. And the collective needs evolved individuals more than it needs conforming participants.